If you want to understand the sheer, unbridled power of American ingenuity in the 20th century, you do not look at the skyscrapers of New York or the assembly lines of Detroit. You look beneath the frozen mud of Berlin in 1955. At the height of the Cold War, when the world was holding its breath in anticipation of a nuclear apocalypse, the United States Central Intelligence Agency, in a partnership of supreme audacity with the British Secret Intelligence Service, executed what remains one of the most magnificent feats of engineering and espionage in human history. This was Operation Gold. Imagine the scene. In a warehouse disguised as a radar station in the American sector of Rudow, a team of hand-picked engineers and signal corpsmen began to dig. They weren't digging a trench, they were constructing a technological masterpiece. Working in absolute silence, battling the claustrophobia of the Earth and the ever-present threat of discovery, they bored a tunnel nearly 1,500 feet long, passing directly under the world's most dangerous border and into the Soviet zone. Their target was nothing less than the central nervous system of the Red Army. They physically tapped into the subterranean landline cables that carried the most sensitive, high-level communications of the Soviet military headquarters. For 11 glorious months, the West owned the secrets of the East. The tunnel was a marvel of American logistical dominance, outfitted with air conditioning to prevent the soil from warming and revealing their location to melting snow above, and lined with hundreds of state-of-the-art reel-to-reel tape recorders that spun day and night. The CIA was drinking from a fire hose of pure intelligence. They heard the troop movements, the logistical shortages, the personal gossip of generals, and the strategic anxieties of the Kremlin. It was the ultimate vindication of the free world's technological superiority, a silent victory that proved no wall, no iron curtain, and no totalitarian regime could hide from the reach of liberty and American determination. The Soviet Union, the terrifying bear of the East, was being played for a fool, its secrets laid bare on the desks of intelligence analysts in Washington and London. It was a moment of absolute triumph, a proof of concept that the West could outthink, outbuild, and outspy the enemy. It was perfect, it was brilliant, it was the pride of the agency. And tragically, unbeknownst to the men popping champagne in the listening post, the entire operation was a theatrical performance orchestrated by Moscow, allowed to happen because the Soviets had a weapon far more potent than a tunnel. They had George Blake. To understand how the grandest American intelligence success became its most humiliating failure, we must leave the muddy tunnels of Berlin and travel back to the smoke-choked streets of Rotterdam in the 1920s. George Blake was not born into the British aristocracy like many of his colleagues in the intelligence services. He was born George Bahar in 1922, a child of displacement and complex identity. His father was a Sephardic Jew from Constantinople who had gained British citizenship through service in the First World War, and his mother was Dutch. From his very first breath, George was a citizen of everywhere and nowhere, a man who learned to navigate the fluid boundaries of nationality and loyalty before he could even tie his shoes. His early life was a masterclass in adaptation, a skill that would eventually rot his soul but save his skin. When his father died, the young George was sent to live with rich relatives in Cairo, where he was exposed to the rigid hierarchies of the British Empire and the bubbling resentment of colonial subjects, planting the first seeds of a worldview that saw the West not as a savior, but as an oppressor. But it was the eruption of the Second World War that forged the spy. When the Nazi war machine blitzed through the Netherlands in 1940, the teenage George was visiting his mother. Trapped behind enemy lines, witnessing the terrifying efficiency of the German occupation, he did not cower. Instead, he joined the Dutch resistance. This is the period that truly created George Blake. He served as a courier, a boy cycling through the rain-slicked streets of Rotterdam, carrying messages that could get him tortured and executed if discovered. He learned to lie with a smile. He learned to suppress his fear until it became a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He learned that survival often meant being someone else. In a moment that foreshadowed his entire life, he was eventually forced to flee the Nazis, and he did so in disguise, dressing as a monk and traversing France and Spain to reach the safety of England. When he arrived, he was no longer just George Bahar. He was a warrior who had looked evil in the face and survived. He changed his name to George Blake to sound more English, joined the Royal Navy, and was almost immediately snatched up by British naval intelligence. They looked at him and saw a gold mine. He was fluent in multiple languages, he was battle-hardened, and he was a blank slate. They recruited him into MI6, the secret intelligence service, believing they had found a patriot. They had no idea they had just recruited their own executioner. The tragedy of George Blake is that his betrayal was not born of greed or blackmail, but of a twisted form of conviction found in the frozen hellscape of the Korean War. In 1948, MI6 sent Blake to Seoul, South Korea, under the cover of a vice consul. His mission was to gather intelligence on the Communist North and the Soviet Far East. But in June 1950, the Cold War turned hot. The North Korean People's Army surged across the 38th parallel, smashing through defenses and capturing Seoul. Blake, along with other diplomats, missionaries, and journalists, was taken prisoner. For the next 3 years, he vanished into the black hole of the North Korean Gulag system. The official narrative for decades, the one the British government desperately wanted to believe, was that Blake was tortured, beaten, and brainwashed until his mind fractured. It was easier to believe that a good British agent had been broken by barbaric methods than to accept the reality. But the reality, according to Blake himself, was far more disturbing. Blake was not waterboarded into submission, he was converted by what he saw. During the Death March in the winter of 1950, where prisoners died of hypothermia and starvation by the roadside, Blake watched the might of the American military unleashed on the peninsula. He saw massive B-29 super fortresses raining destruction down on primitive wooden villages. He saw women, children, and old men burned and broken by the terrifying machinery of Western warfare. In his memoir, he later claimed that the contrast between the high-tech violence of the Christian West and the suffering of the Korean peasants broke his faith in his own side. He began to read the works of Marx and Lenin in the prison camps provided by his captors. He engaged in long philosophical debates with the KGB interrogators. Slowly, deliberately, and with a terrifying intellectual clarity, he decided that he was on the wrong side of history. He decided that communism, despite its brutality, was a noble experiment to uplift the common man, and that the West was an imperialist monster. He did not wait to be broken, he volunteered. He approached his guards and offered his services to the KGB. He didn't just agree to spy, he offered to become a fully operational mole within the heart of British intelligence. When George Blake was released and returned to London in 1953, he was greeted as a conquering hero. The press hailed him as a survivor of the Red Menace. His superiors at MI6 patted him on the back, gave him back pay, and, in a stroke of catastrophic irony, promoted him. They didn't just give him a desk job, they placed him in Section Y. This was the holy grail of irony. Section Y was the department responsible for processing the audio recordings from wiretaps on Soviet lines, including the very tunnels the Americans were digging. The fox was not just in the henhouse, the fox was in charge of the security system. For nearly a decade, George Blake lived a breathtaking double life. By day, he was the polite, hard-working civil servant, a family man who married a secretary from the office and had 3 children. He was the neighbor you borrowed sugar from, the man you sat next to on the bus. But by night, or during his lunch breaks, he was dismantling the Western intelligence network brick by brick. His betrayal was industrial in scale. He didn't just memorize secrets, he stole them physically. He would take top-secret files, documents listing the names of agents, the locations of safe houses, the technical specs of listening devices, and wait until the office was empty. Then he would pull out a tiny Minox camera, photograph page after page, and return the files. He would meet his KGB handlers, Sergei and Nikolai, on double-decker buses, quickly exchanging rolls of film for new instructions, or drop packages in predetermined dead drops in quiet parks. He gave them everything. He gave them the order of battle, a document detailing the structure of the entire Western intelligence presence in Europe. And, of course, he gave them the Berlin Tunnel. This brings us back to the great American triumph. The Soviets knew about Operation Gold while the blueprints were still wet ink. Blake had handed them the minutes of the planning meeting. The KGB was faced with a choice: destroy the tunnel immediately and save their communications, or let it run to protect Blake. They chose Blake. They valued his placement in London more than the conversations of their own generals in Berlin. For 11 months, the KGB carefully rerouted their most critical communications to landlines the tunnel couldn't reach, or simply refrained from saying anything truly damning on the tapped lines. They allowed the Americans to record thousands of hours of mundane chatter, military gossip, and low-level logistics, feeding the CIA a diet of junk food intelligence to keep them happy and unsuspecting. When the Soviets finally discovered the tunnel in 1956, they staged a magnificent piece of theater, acting shocked and outraged for the international press, while Blake watched from London, quietly amused by the farce he had helped orchestrate. If Blake's betrayal had been limited to tunnels and documents, he would be remembered as a damaging spy. But his legacy is written in blood. The information he provided to the KGB contained the names and personal details of hundreds of agents working for the British and Americans behind the Iron Curtain. These were men and women, Polish, East German, Russian, Hungarian, who had trusted the West with their lives. Because of George Blake, that trust became a death sentence. Throughout the late 1950s, a strange and terrifying silence began to fall over the intelligence networks of Europe. Agents would miss a check-in, safe houses would be found empty, men would vanish while walking their dogs or buying groceries, only to reappear months later in a show trial or never be seen again. Historians estimate that George Blake betrayed approximately 400 agents, 400 human lives. Some were imprisoned for decades in the gulags. Many were executed, shot in the back of the head in the basements of KGB prisons. Blake, safe in his London home, drinking tea with his wife, knew exactly what he was doing. When later confronted with the deaths he caused, he dismissed them with a chilling sociopathy, claiming that these men were also spies and knew the risks of the game. He refused to see them as victims, viewing them merely as pawns that he had removed from the board in service of his great ideological crusade. This was the true face of George Blake, not the charming diplomat, but a man who could sign 400 death warrants without losing a night's sleep. No secret stays buried forever. By 1961, the hemorrhage of information from London had become too obvious to ignore. The CIA and MI6 knew there was a mole, they just couldn't find him. The breakthrough came not from detective work, but from another traitor. A high-ranking Polish intelligence officer named Michał Goleniewski, using the codename Sniper, defected to the United States. He brought with him a treasure trove of documents, including details about a Soviet mole inside British intelligence. The clues were specific. The mole had worked in Korea, he was in Section Y, and he was currently posted in the Middle East. The pieces of the puzzle snapped together to form the face of George Blake. At the time, Blake was studying Arabic in Lebanon, preparing for a new assignment. MI6 summoned him back to London, dangling the bait of a promotion. Blake, perhaps grown arrogant after years of getting away with it, took the bait. He returned to London, was driven to MI6 headquarters, and walked into an interrogation room. At first, the interrogation was polite, a gentlemanly dance of accusation and denial. Blake played the outraged patriot perfectly, But the interrogators were relentless. They knew. Finally, one of the interrogators tried a psychological gambit. He suggested that perhaps Blake had been tortured in Korea, that he had been forced into this, giving him a way to frame his treason as the result of trauma rather than malice. It was a lifeline. But Blake, in a moment of supreme hubris, slapped it away. He looked at them and said, "No, nobody tortured me. I did it because I believe in the cause." He confessed. He told them everything. The trial was held in secret, in camera, to protect what little national security was left. The British establishment was shaken to its core. When it came time for sentencing, Lord Parker, the Lord Chief Justice, decided to make an example of Blake that would ring through the ages. The maximum sentence for a single count of espionage was 14 years. Blake was charged with 5 counts. In a move that shocked the legal world, the judge ordered the sentences to run consecutively, one after the other, for a total of 42 years. It was a sentence designed to ensure that George Blake would die in prison. He was stripped of his status, his reputation, and his freedom, and thrown into Wormwood Scrubs, a Victorian fortress of red brick and iron in West London. The door slammed shut. The world moved on. Wormwood Scrubs was a grim place, but it was not a supermax facility by modern standards. It was a prison run on routine, and George Blake was a master of exploiting routine. He did not rage against his cell walls. He became the model prisoner. He was polite to the guards, he worked in the prison sewing shop, and he acted as a mentor to younger inmates. He lulled the system to sleep. He was housed in D Hall, which contained a strange mix of hardened criminals and political activists. It was here that Blake formed an alliance that sounds like the setup to a bad joke. A Soviet master spy, a petty Irish criminal named Sean Burke, and 2 anti-nuclear peace activists, Michael Randall and Pat Pottle. These men did not see Blake as a monster. Burke saw an opportunity to thumb his nose at the British authority he hated. Randall and Pottle saw a man serving a sentence they believed was inhumane and excessive. Together, they hatched a plan. It was not high-tech. It involved no explosives, no helicopters, and no guns. It involved a walkie-talkie and knitting needles. Sean Burke, who was released from prison first, became the outside man. He bought an eye-end walkie-talkie and smuggled a matching unit into the prison to Blake, likely via a sympathetic trustee. For the first time, the prisoner and his rescuer could talk. They coordinated a date, October 22, 1966. The plan relied on the weekly movie screening. While the guards and prisoners were distracted by a film, Blake would make his move. But the physical problem remained, the wall. It was massive, 20 feet high, imposing brick. Burke, displaying a stroke of bizarre genius, constructed a rope ladder. But a rope ladder is flimsy. It collapses and sways. He needed to reinforce the rungs to keep them open for a foothold. He went to a local shop and bought dozens of knitting needles. He used them as struts, bracing the rope rungs. On the night of the escape, a torrential rainstorm battered London. It was the perfect cover. The noise of the rain masked their movements, and the miserable weather kept the guards inside. Blake slipped away from the movie hall. He broke a window pane in a corridor, squeezed his body through the jagged glass, and dropped onto a porch roof. From there, he jumped down into the prison yard. He was alone in the dark, the rain soaking him to the bone. He ran to the wall. On the other side, Sean Burke threw the knitting needle ladder over. It caught on the coping. Blake grabbed the ropes. He began to climb. It was a desperate physical struggle, a middle-aged man hauling himself up a slippery wall on his own ladder. He reached the top, straddled the wall, and looked down. The drop was farther than he expected. He had no choice. He let go. He hit the concrete on the outside with a sickening crunch. He had broken his wrist and suffered a nasty cut to his head. He was semi-conscious, groaning in pain. Burke dragged him to a waiting car, shoved him into the back seat, and they sped off into the night just as the prison sirens began to wail. The fox was loose. The police launched the biggest manhunt in British history. They tore apart airports, they watched the ports, they raided known communist sympathizers. But Blake was gone. Or rather, he wasn't. In a twist that humiliated the police, Blake didn't leave the country immediately. He was hiding in an apartment just a stone's throw from the prison. He spent weeks moving between safe houses provided by Randall and Pottle. He sat on sofas, nursing his broken wrist, watching the television news reports about the frantic search for him. The final act of his escape was the most daring of all. Michael Randall customized a Bedford Dormobile, a family camper van. He built a secret compartment under the bench seat where his children sat. He loaded his wife and kids into the van, tucked the most wanted man in the world into the dark, cramped box beneath them, and drove to the ferry at Dover. They passed through customs with a wave. The officers saw a nice British family going on a holiday. They didn't think to look under the seat. They drove across the Channel, through Belgium and West Germany, all the way to the Helmstedt checkpoint. Blake climbed out of his hiding spot, walked across the border into East Germany, and was greeted by his KGB handlers. He had done the impossible. He had humiliated the British government, betrayed his country, and escaped a 42-year sentence with knitting needles. George Blake spent the next 54 years in Russia. He was given a hero's welcome, awarded the Order of Lenin, and given a dacha in the woods outside Moscow. He learned Russian, remarried, and had a son. He lived a comfortable life, a member of the KGB elite, drinking vodka and hunting in the forests. But there is a profound emptiness in the victory of a traitor. He had left behind his wife and children in England to deal with the fallout of his crimes. He watched from afar as the Soviet Union, the utopia he had sacrificed his soul to serve, slowly rotted from the inside. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Blake did not repent. Unlike many other defectors who fell into alcoholism or despair, Blake remained stubbornly proud. He refused to admit he was wrong. He called communism a noble ideal that humanity simply wasn't ready for. He lived into his 90s, a living fossil of the Cold War, receiving birthday cards from Vladimir Putin. He died in 2020 at the age of 98, passing away in his sleep in Moscow. As we look back at the life of George Blake, we are left with a story that feels more like fiction than reality. It is a story that begins with the greatest technological triumph of America, the Berlin Tunnel, and ends with the betrayal of that triumph by a single man. It is a story of a prison break that embarrassed an empire, executed with tools from a sewing basket. But beneath the adventure and the intrigue lies a darker truth. George Blake was a man who looked at his own country and saw an enemy. He looked at his own colleagues and saw targets. He was a man of supreme conviction, and that conviction allowed him to send hundreds of men to their deaths without blinking. He was the spy who broke the world, and in the end, he got away with it. He died a hero in the land of his enemy, a final silent mockery of the justice he escaped.